Sorry about that. Telephone rang, so that happens. Um, so picking up where I left off, the the death scene in Stoner is beautifully rendered piece of writing, um, and I don't know because I haven't really researched it at all what Williams' ideas were about death and life after death and issues of that nature. Um, but it does lead us to thinking about um, the quality of life that Stoner had. Just have to respond to a text. There we go. Um, and I would argue strongly that William Stoner lived a very good life in some ways. Good, not in the fact that not in that he was comfortable or happy all the time. I think he took great joy, obviously, in his work, despite the fact that it was difficult at times dealing with the departmental politics that he had to face around both Charles Watson's character and all of that, and then later with Catherine Driscoll. Um, he made of it what he could. He made of his life a good thing. If you go back to the first paragraphs of the novel, the first 4 or 5 paragraphs, you get a sense that his life added up to almost nothing, which most of our lives will probably add up to mostly nothing. Will be remembered for a time by the people that loved us, and then when they're dead, um, they won't be remembered. We won't be remembered. I was thinking about this with my mother not so long ago. Um, she died about 5 years ago or so. She lived a very difficult life in a lot of ways. Growing up in the Great Depression, World War II, and the privations around that time period, but also, um, a marriage that wasn't always happy. She lived to see, her sons into adulthood and into all three of us into being married at least once. And she took great pride in her sons. She loved deeply. She loved her granddaughter. Um, but I began thinking, well, she's been cremated, and she'll be interred with my dad when my dad dies, and they have a marker in a cemetery in my father's hometown of Margaretville in New York. And people passing by their grave will see this little bench marker that is there, and underneath the bench will be their 2 urns of ashes, and no one will know them. And after I die and my brothers die and my niece dies, there won't be anyone left on earth that will have known her. And what does that say about a life? And that, I think, is what both John Williams in Stoner and Willa Cather at the end of Death Comes for the Archbishop are essentially saying. And that novel you know nothing about other than what I've said, but it's a novel whose title gives away the very last page. Death Comes for the Archbishop, and it's really all about his life, from page 1 to the very last page. Details, sometimes in great detail, his coming of age, his decision to go into the priesthood, a decision that wasn't easy for him because, of course, priests take an oath of celibacy, so they know they're not going to have any progeny if they follow the oath that they've taken. And they're not supposed to be thinking about, becoming famous or becoming well known. Some do, of course. Some rise to high levels within the church. He rises to the level of archbishop, which is a very high level in the Catholic Church. But he leaves home. He's born and raised in France, and then he ends up in Mexico and the desert Southwest. And his calling is to serve the people where he is given a charge to serve the people. And he builds this church. But what does his life add up to? It adds up to a paragraph at the very end of that. And I just wanted to take a quick look at that paragraph. It's on page 299, and it's the second to last paragraph of Death Comes for the Archbishop. He continued to murmur, to move his hands a little, and Magdalena thought he was trying to ask for something, or to tell them something. But in reality, the bishop was not there at all. He was standing in a tilted green field among his native mountains, and he was trying to give consolation to a young man who was being torn in two before his eyes by the desire to go and the necessity to stay. He was trying to forge a new will in that devout and exhausted priest, and the time was short, for the diligence for Paris was already rumbling down the mountain gorge. He's recalling at the moment of his death, the moment where he, as a young man, makes the decision ultimately to leave, to go to Paris, and then to be taken into the priesthood, this life of, in some ways, great loneliness, and then to travel to a foreign, very undeveloped place and try to work with the people that he finds there. And so this last image that he has as he's dying is of himself as an old priest talking to himself as a young priest, trying to console him and encourage him in that chosen life, or in that life that may not be chosen. In the Catholic Church, you have a calling, which means that you have to answer. And if that calling is toward the priesthood or toward being a nun, you follow that calling. It's a direct order from God, if you will, or from the Holy Spirit. And you can see this as a very sad ending. You can see it as a triumphant ending, and that's the way that the old priest sees himself in his dying moments. I don't think there's that level of comfort for Stoner in his dying moments, and we'll look at that in a minute. But I just wanted to quote Shakespeare, and you'll see that I uploaded the poem that I referred to last week, Of Mere Being, also by Wallace Stevens. And these great writers that grapple with death and trying to understand it, this human thing that we're all going to go through, every living creature goes through. It's just a small quotation from Hamlet's famous soliloquy, the to be or not to be speech, which is about existence. People think of it as a contemplation of suicide, and maybe it is. I think there's some suggestion in there that he's thinking about ending his own life, but it doesn't have to be seen that way. But he is thinking about death, both as a comforting thing, as a cousin to sleep, as opposed to a terrifying thing. But in the part that I'm about to read, he is contemplating what that place is that we go to. Who would fardels bear? Fardels is an old word for burdens. So who would bear burdens, or who would burdens bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life? But that the dread of something after death, that undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. So Hamlet's saying, life may be dreary and filled with sweat and toil, but that the dread of something after death, the fear of what might be in the afterlife, if there is one, or total annihilation, an even scarier thing to contemplate, puzzles the will, keeps us from perhaps ending our lives and seeking death because we don't know, and so we'd rather put up with what we have than fly to things we know not of, than to go to things that we don't understand or have no window into. And so that's how Shakespeare, at least in that speech, deals with death. Turning now to Wallace Stevens' The Dinner Bell in the Woods and Of Mere Being, and then we'll take a peek at Stoner, and then I'll be done. In his last years, I noted this before, Stevens went from writing very long, complicated poems that would stretch over pages to writing mostly very short poems, with stanzas, two-line or three-line stanzas, maybe 4 lines, many of them dealing directly with death, because he knew he was dying, and he was dying of throat cancer, which was a terrible way to go. And often people in that sort of place are not able to enjoy anything of life. The pain is intense. The drugs make you dopey and make you sleep, as what happens with Stoner, who's also dying of cancer. But somewhere in that, Stevens was able to imagine a world, imagine death as something different. And again, I don't know anything about his actual religious beliefs or anything like that. I've never really studied that part of his life or his thinking. But he imagines it as a portal, as something transforming, obviously, and I don't want to say positive, but I don't want to say negative either. And The Dinner Bell in the Woods is just a lovely little poem that's a little peculiar in some ways, but I think when you dig around in it, you discover this place between life and death that he's imagining, that he calls phantasma, twice in the poem, and it's almost as if the unnamed person in the poem, the he, the man in the poem, maybe him, maybe not, is called back from the edge of death by all of the life around him in this peculiar little picnic scene in the woods. He was facing phantasma when the dinner bell rang. The picnic of children came running then in a burst of shouts under the trees and through the air. The smaller ones came tinkling on the grass to the table where the fattest woman belled the glass. The point of it was the way he heard it, in the green, outside the door of Phantasma. And I know I have a typo in there. I have or Phantasma. Apologies for that. It doesn't matter how many times you proofread something, you can read right over an error, and I will make that correction before the next semester of English 102 students. It seems to me an evening scene is a dinner bell, so either dinner in the old sense of lunch or dinner as in the way most of us refer to dinner out with somebody as supper or a meal at evening. It's a picnic. It's a celebratory event. We don't know, 4th of July, Memorial Day, or just a family picnic. It seems to be a large group of people, picnic of children came running then in a burst of shouts under the trees through the air. The woman that is referred to as the fattest woman belled the glass. She's ringing a glass dinner bell of some sort or other. And it's this burst of energy that brings him back either from the contemplation of death, which is one way to look at it. He was facing Phantasma, or outside the door of Phantasma, or perhaps he is almost at the moment of his death, and that this somehow all of this energy comes into the scene and pulls him back from that contemplation or from that reality of death. It's a lovely thing, and it's the point of it is not that happened, but it is the way that it happened in the green outside the door of Phantasma. That there's something in nature, that this doesn't take place in an apartment or a house or a dining hall or any other place where dinner might take place. It's an outdoor picnic, woods, fields, birds, warm temperatures. Nobody has a picnic in the middle of January, at least in our part of the world. And so it is this pleasant family scene and energy of young children and of this woman and of eating, of sharing food, of celebration that pulls him back from this sort of brink. Of Near Being is an even more poignant poem to me. It's always, if you pick up an anthology of Wallace Stevens' poems, or you look at Wallace Stevens' section of a book of American poetry, it will almost always be included. I think most critics consider it one of his greatest poems. I certainly do. And it always occurs last. It's always in the final position. And I don't know if it's the last poem Stevens wrote. I have no idea. I don't know if scholars know that. In fact, it's dated for 1954, which is the year that he died. And it comes in that rush of short poems that he produced in the last 3 to 4 years of his life, when he was beginning to die and then actively dying. And it calls to mind an image of the phoenix, which is the firebird in mythology that reproduces by consumption of itself in a burst of flame. The phoenix bursts into flame, and out of the ashes of the old phoenix rises a new phoenix. So it's an image of regeneration, of reincarnation, not of dying and going to heaven or hell or purgatory or any other assigned place, but rather returning with that same energy, but in a new form. That many religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, among them, as the biggest anyway, that they imagine that is what life is after death, is that you are regenerated, you become, your soul lives on, you go on to a new form, and another person, or in some religions you turn into maybe a different kind of animal depending on how you lived your life. Humans being the highest form, so if you are a human being, which we all are, that we've been through many lives before in various forms, and we've finally risen to that level. And in Buddhism, there are levels beyond human, where you are like a bodhisattva, which is a mythical being that comes down to earth in a form and rescues other people, not in a physical sense, but saves other people from themselves, if you will. There seems to be all of those energies in this poem, and it's it's just a remarkable thing. He imagines, again, death and dying not as some terrible thing, but as in this poem anyway, as a transformation from one thing to another thing. And also he imagines it as sort of an island off the mainland, with a tropical sort of scene, warm and glowing and beautiful and golden. The and among the things about this poem that make it utterly stunning to me is just his use of language. It's beautifully written. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze distance. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. You know then that this is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. The bird sings, its feathers shine. The palm stands on the edge of space. The wind moves slowly in the branches. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down, which is, to me, the most beautiful line ever written in a poem by anybody, anytime. This image of the bird in the palm tree at the end of the mind, at the end of consciousness, beyond anything that we can know or understand. Hey, Ace, my dog is visiting. It gives that transcendence, that moment of release from earthly bounds. You know, birds have always been seen as sort of favored creatures that, through the magic of flight, can get above and beyond, the mere human. The phoenix is a bird, and in this poem, as in all mythological references to the phoenix, it consumes itself in fire and then is born again. There's no hint in this poem at all of anything like a Christian idea of dying and going to heaven. It's heavenly imagery. It's beautiful. The palm at the end of the mind is on this sort of distant island, and everything is in the bronze distance. Everything is away. Everything is far from human consciousness until we reach that end, where we face the end, where we face death. And that last stanza, before that, the idea that this is beyond human comprehension, beyond human meaning, he says, without human feeling, a foreign song, that this is something that we cannot put into words, in our own words. It's an experience we'll all have, but it is not something that we can readily comprehend. It's nature. It is whatever caused the universe to come into being has caused death to come into being as well, and that our job is just to accept that that's the way that the universe works. That last stanza, the palm stands on the edge of space, period. The wind moves slowly in the branches, period. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. It's death, rebirth. It's this space that we don't understand. It's the edge of space. It's the edge of consciousness. It's the edge of human understanding, the edge of knowing, beyond anything that we can encompass between our ears. And so we must just experience it. We must just live it. And whatever the consequences are, accept them. And lastly, of course, Stoner, in the very last page of the book, or pages of the book, there are a couple of things I wanted to just note, partly because of the beauty of it. He's written this one book. He's accomplished this one great thing in his life. He had started a second book, and then it kind of petered out with the whole Catherine Driscoll affair and the troubles that he was having with his, his job, his occupation. and so forth. And in his last moments, he thinks about his book. He reaches for his book, and he actually drops it. It's the very last thing that he does. As he dies, the book tumbles from his dying hands. But before that, he has a moment very much like those in the Wallace Stevens poems. It occurred to him, this is on page 276, it occurred to him that he ought to call Edith, and then he knew that he would not call her. The dying are selfish, he thought. They want their moments to themselves, like children. He was breathing again, but there was a difference within him that he could not name. He felt that he was waiting for something, or for some knowledge, but it seemed to him that he had all the time in the world. It's so much like the Wallace Stevens poem. I don't know if Williams was familiar with the poem. I'm sure he was. He was a English professor and a writer and a reader, obviously. And one couldn't be alive in that time and not know the poetry of Wallace Stevens if one was a literary sort of person, excuse me. Now here's the part that I love and that is so mysterious of in his dying hours. He heard the distant sound of laughter. It's like the bell in the woods, isn't it? He heard the distant sound of laughter, and he turned his head toward its source. A group of students had cut across his backyard lawn. They were hurrying somewhere. He saw them distinctly. There were 3 couples. The girls were long-limbed and graceful in their light summer dresses, and the boys were looking at them with a joyous and bemused wonder. They walked lightly upon the grass, hardly touching it, leaving no trace of where they had been. He watched them as they went out of his sight, where he could not see, and for a long time after they had vanished, the sound of their laughter came to him, far and unknowing, in the quiet of the summer afternoon. What did you expect? He thought again. Pause here. Just gorgeous writing. This is Williams at the top of his game. Are these real people, these students? Are they figments of his imagination? It doesn't matter. They seem to come and go like ghosts. They leave no trace that they'd been there, but it's summer. It's not winter. They're not leaving footprints in the snow. It's just, the possibility of young people cutting across a lawn in the summer, enjoying their youngness, their youth, their beauty. The boys are looking at the girls are looking at the boys. There's love in the air. It's summer. It's beautiful. And yet up above them, watching them, unbeknownst to them, is a man dying. So you have the 2 ends of life here. You have Edith when she was young. You have Grace before she became an alcoholic. You have all those possibilities. You have Stoner when he was a young man, falling in love with Edith, then as an older man falling in love with Catherine. So you have all of these things tying themselves back together again at his very end. A kind of joy came upon him as if borne on a summer breeze. He dimly recalled that he had been thinking of failure, or as if it mattered, rather. It seemed to him now that such thoughts were mean, unworthy of what his life had been. Dim presences gathered at the edge of his consciousness. He could not see them, but he knew that they were there, gathering their forces toward a kind of palpability he could not see or hear. He was approaching them, he knew, but there was no need to hurry. He could ignore them if he wished. He had all the time there was. Well, of course he doesn't, but he's in that, under the influence, obviously, of morphine for his pain, and it is making his thoughts foggy and so on. There was a softness around him, and a languor crept upon his limbs. A sense of his own identity came upon him with a sudden force, and he felt the power of it. He was himself, and he knew what he had been. His head turned. His bedside table was piled with books that he had not touched for a long time. He let his hand play over them for a moment. He marveled at the thinness of the fingers, at the intricate articulation of the joints as he flexed them. This takes us right back to his first encounter with poetry, where he does the same thing as he's sitting in the classroom. He's contemplating his hands while he's trying to come up with an answer to the question asked, what is the meaning of this poem? He finally is understanding the meaning of this poem, going all the way back to the Shakespeare sonnet. He felt the strength within them and let them pull a book from the jumble on the tabletop. It was his own book that he saw it, and when the hand held it, he smiled at the familiar red cover that had for a long time been faded and scuffed. It hardly mattered to him that the book was forgotten and that it served no use, and the question of its worth at any time seemed almost trivial. He did not have the illusion that he would find himself there in that faded print, and yet he knew a small part of him that he could not deny was there and would be there. He opened his book, and as he did so, it became not his own. He let his fingers riffle through the pages and felt a tingling, as if those pages were alive. The tingling came through his fingers and coursed through his flesh and bone. He was minutely aware of it, and he waited until it contained him, until the old excitement that was like terror fixed him where he lay. The sunlight passing his window shone upon the page, and he could not see what was written there. The fingers loosened, and the book that they had held moved slowly and then swiftly across the still body and fell into the silence of the room. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. His whole life has been this book that is meaningless to him now, meaningless to others, not used, and yet so important. You know, what is the tale of any person's life? What are our goals? What do we live for, and what do we die for? It's some powerful thoughts to end a semester on. Your last piece of writing is up, posted on D2L, and it's more positive. It can be. It's about good and evil, about right and wrong. And I give you a quotation from one of my favorite movies, Apocalypse Now, a 1978 film by Francis Ford Coppola. And it's just a quotation that I love, that I've always loved since the first time seeing the movie way back when it first was released. I'm that old. So anyway, it's a quotation that I ask you to read and then respond to some prompts, but don't feel you have to respond to every question in that order. Just it's kind of a free-for-all. It's write what you want, as long as you deal with the subject matter. And with that, again, I've enjoyed immensely reading your essays. You've worked hard and you've earned your grades, and I will be seeing your last essays hopefully soon.